Lately, and by lately, I mean the last several years, I've been thinking a lot about an episode of the classic original Twilight Zone. It's called The Shelter. Me thinking about Twilight Zone episodes is nothing unusual. It's one of my favorite shows ever. Its creator, Rod Serling, has been a role model for me as a writer. Serling comes from a generation of writers who have been role models to me, writers who first rose to prominence during the golden age of television in the 1950s. Reginald Rose, who wrote 12 Angry Men, Patty Chayefsky, who wrote Network, as well as Serling's regular roster of writers on The Twilight Zone, Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, George Clayton Johnson. They and others from that era I didn't name were skilled in the mechanics of storytelling, but deeper than that, they wrote stories that were about something, that had something to say. That was, in large measure, the point of The Twilight Zone, to use the tropes of fantasy, sci-fi, horror, and other genres in which the show dabbled, as well as attention-grabbing techniques like twist endings, to present stories that weren't just entertaining, but that were relevant to the people watching them in the late 50s and early 60s. Some episodes of The Twilight Zone, many of them, in fact, are still relevant to us today. That speaks to the timelessness of the show, which is a good thing, but it also speaks to how little progress we've made since the show was produced, which is a bad thing. The episode I've been thinking about, The Shelter, is a good one, but for most of my time as a fan of The Twilight Zone, which is pretty much my entire life, I wouldn't have called it one of my favorites. These last several years, though, I can't seem to get it out of my head. It begins, as many Twilight Zones do, with a group of ordinary people doing an ordinary thing when something unexpected happens and the bottom seems to drop out of the world. There's a birthday party for Bill Stockton, a small-town doctor with a wife and a preteen son. The party is attended by Bill's best friend Jerry and Jerry's wife Martha, and some other friends who all live on the same suburban street. Marty and his nameless wife, Frank and his nameless wife. Bill pretends to be annoyed at the party, he doesn't like this sort of thing, and the others tease Bill about that silly bomb shelter he built under his house, but it's smiles and appreciations and good-natured ribbing all around, just a happy bunch of neighbors. Then, as the party is breaking up, an announcement comes over the radio. Missiles have been detected heading toward the United States. Everyone is urged to take cover immediately. If you have a shelter, go to it now, the radio announcer says. The others run home, and Bill and his wife, Grace, and their son, Paul, start getting the bomb shelter ready. As Bill is about to carry the last of the water down, his best buddy Jerry taps on the window and asks if maybe Bill could make room in that shelter for old Jerry and his family. Bill refuses. He built that shelter for himself, his wife, and his son. It was made for 3 people. It can only accommodate 3 people. And given the circumstances, unfortunately, Bill has to take care of his family and can't afford to jeopardize them by letting anyone else in. Jerry's not happy to hear that. And Jerry's not the last of Bill's neighbors to show up asking for a spot in his bomb shelter. Nobody else in the neighborhood had the foresight to build a shelter. They thought Bill was being eccentric, alarmist when he built his. Now things are different. From behind the shelter's heavy door, Bill, Grace, and Paul listen. First, as their neighbors take turns begging to be let in, then as their neighbors turn on each other. It's not long before the racism comes out. Marty is an immigrant. His exact place of origin isn't specified, but it's implied that he's Jewish. When Frank goes after him, he makes sure to get Marty's surname, Weiss, in there. Frank and his wife angrily assert that they and their family have more of a right to a spot in the shelter than Marty and his because Marty's not even from here. Frank calls Marty a foreigner and a pushy, grabby semi-American. Frank's wife viciously barks, "For my dough, Weiss, you're at the bottom of the list." Eventually, all the neighbors who have been locked out of the shelter decide that the only thing to do is to break down the door. Because if they all have to die when the bombs fall, it's only fair that Bill and his family die too. And that's just what they do. They get a long piece of heavy pipe from someone's basement and they batter their way through the door. And just as they break in, the radio announcer comes on and declares that it was a false alarm. Those weren't missiles that were detected. They were satellites. Everything is fine. Only it's definitely not fine. Frank tries to apologize to Marty for the hateful things he said, but Marty just listens in silence. A shell-shocked Bill staggers through the wrecked door of his shelter, while Jerry promises that they'll all chip in to pay for the damages. Marty proposes a block party, and Jerry says, "Hey, that's a great idea. Anything to get back to normal." And that's when Bill stops and says, "I don't know what normal is." Jerry reiterates that they'll pay for the damages, and Bill turns around and says, "I wonder if any one of us has any idea what those damages really are."
Maybe one of them is finding out what we're really like when we're normal.
There's a bit more Serling-esque speechifying from there, but that's pretty much it. You can probably guess why this episode has resonated with me so strongly. Maybe if you also know the original Twilight Zone, you've been thinking about it too. Some aspects of it feel dated. Bomb shelters aren't really a thing anymore. The fear of a nuclear attack is no longer an everyday part of life, at least here in the United States. But it's not the specific scenario that feels relevant today. It's the behavior of the people when they're put under stress. It's when they turn on each other and the ways in which they turn on each other. One of the most discouraging things about the last decade or so of American history that I'm assuming we've all lived through — I hope there are no 9-year-olds watching this in 2026. Thanks for the view, but your parents need to get their shit together, kids. Anyway, one of the most discouraging things about the last decade or so has been the great unmasking that has occurred, mostly as a result of the Donald Trump campaigns and presidencies and the COVID-19 pandemic. Other countries have had their versions of this as well, but I'm the most familiar with what's been going on in the United States, so that's what I talk about, and that's what I think about when I think about the shelter. We haven't had an imminent nuclear bombing to panic over, but we have had 10 years of political and social movements that have set back progress to a point that it will take many years to recover from, and have revealed many of our friends, neighbors, and family members to be very different than the people we thought they were. When Frank tries to make nice with Marty after the alarm is canceled, he says, "I went off my rocker. I was scared, confused. I didn't mean any of those things." He blames it on the stress. He tries to take it back. And sure, the stress was part of it. Frank wanted to stay alive and keep his family alive, and he said things to Marty he would never have said under other circumstances. The thing is, though, what he said to Marty, calling him a foreigner and a semi-American, and if it were real life and Frank's language wasn't limited by U.S. television broadcast standards circa 1961, we can imagine him saying far worse things to Marty. All of that was in there, in Frank's head, in Frank's heart, waiting to come out. The circumstances didn't create those racist attitudes Frank expressed. They merely gave Frank permission to express them. And that person in your life, that aunt or uncle or cousin or sibling or parent, that coworker, that friend from school you don't really hang out with anymore but are still connected to on Facebook, the one who never seemed racist or sexist or homophobic before, who suddenly started vocally supporting Donald Trump and cheering on his anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-woman, anti-gay, and anti-trans, and anti the rest of the whole goddamn world policies. They're just like Frank. Or that person you know who suddenly became a conspiracy theorist, a vaccine skeptic, an anti-masker during COVID, when you'd never seen any of those tendencies from them before. They're just like Frank, too. Trump didn't make anyone racist or xenophobic or misogynist or anything else. The COVID pandemic didn't transform anyone into a gullible, dangerously contrarian dipshit. Those traits were already present. They just needed permission to come out. That's why Bill is so staggered when he emerges from his smashed-in shelter. It's not just the stress of the situation they've all been through. It's not just the fear of nuclear attack that they were all experiencing up until a few moments ago. It's the unmasking of his neighbors. It's the realization that these people who just drove a battering ram through his door are the same people who threw him a birthday party not more than half an hour ago. That line of Bill's that I played the clip of earlier, that line stays with me. The one about how one of the damages caused by this situation is finding out what we're really like when we're normal. Turning on each other, spewing hatred at each other, breaking down Bill's door out of some combination of rage and panic and spite. That's not who they became. That's who they always were. Sure, they were their other selves too. The smiles, the laughs, the jokes, the camaraderie, that was real. But the bigotry and the violence and the foolishness was there too. All the time. And Bill has a point. How do you come back from that? How do you repair the damage when the damage consists of learning the truth? When you've seen a part of someone that they've been hiding and it's ugly and harmful, how do you move on? Let them go back to hiding that part of themselves? Pretend it isn't there? That sure seems to be what Frank would like Marty to do. He never actually apologizes to Marty for what he said. He seems embarrassed by it. He seems regretful. He tries to explain. He says, "You can understand why we all blew our tops a little." But he never says, "I'm sorry." He doesn't want to take responsibility. He just wants to forget all this unpleasantness and get back to normal. We have not yet reached the point where it's safe to emerge from the shelter. I feel like I'm still listening at the door to people I once thought I knew saying and doing the most vile, contemptible things. When this moment finally passes and the sky begins to clear, when someone else is the president and the spell by which Trump and the MAGA movement have kept much of my country enthralled for the past 10 years is broken, the Franks of the world, some of them anyway, are going to walk up sheepishly behind the Martys of the world and say, "Hey, about all that back there, I was off my rocker. You know, you understand." And the Jerrys are going to say, "Hey, it's okay. Let's just get back to normal." But if you're a Bill, and I don't know, I think I might be a Bill. If you're a Bill, you're going to look at Frank and at Jerry, and you're never going to be able to see them the way you once saw them. You'll know that normal, what you thought of as normal, is gone. And it can never come back, that old normal, because that old normal was based on certain assumptions. The assumption that despite our differences, we all agreed on some basic fundamentals, like decency and fairness and wanting to know what the facts are. It turns out those assumptions were false, and many of us, a lot more of us than it seemed like before, never cared about any of those fundamentals. The thing about the shelter that hits me the hardest when I watch it is how quickly everything happens. Without commercials, it runs a tight 25 minutes, and though there are a few brief time jumps between scenes, it unfolds more or less in real time. They go from friendly neighbors to a mob in the time it takes for a pizza to arrive. It didn't happen that fast with Trump, but then again, on the scale of history, it kind of did. 60 years ago, the United States Congress was passing civil rights legislation. Not unanimously by any stretch of the imagination, but even so, real, meaningful, significant change for the better was taking place. Shit, even 15 or 20 years ago, no Republican politician who was prominent on a national level would have ever said a fraction of the things Trump says out loud into microphones or posts to social media from his phone on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. At least no such Republican politician would say those things in public, because if they did, they would be punished, not rewarded. Things weren't perfect before Trump came along. Things weren't even good for many people. The problems Trump has worsened were already there: intolerance, apathy, inequality. There were racists and misogynists and xenophobes. There were people who spread fear and hatred of non-Christians and queer people. There were conspiracy theorists and kooks. But most of us assumed they were out there on the fringe, and though their worldviews were warped and their beliefs were reprehensible, they were mostly harmless because they didn't represent how the rest of us thought and felt and saw the world. Did they? Now here we are, 10 years after the start of the Trump era. 10 years, not such a long time in the history of a country that has existed in its current form, more or less, for a quarter of a millennium. And it just seems so absurd, so unforgivably naive that any of us ever believed that. I watch The Shelter and I see myself in Bill. It's not a flattering comparison, because even though Bill is the protagonist, and even though Bill is the one who was smart enough to prepare for the disaster he knew was possible, and even though Bill is the one who gets to take the moral high ground and make the wounded but wise pronouncement at the end about how destructive it was to their community to see these savage, secret parts of each other, if I'm honest, that's not the part of Bill I relate to the most. I think about myself in the years before Trump. And not just me, but a lot of us, especially those of us privileged enough to actually think that things were going all right and bound to keep getting better. I think about us and our country, and I see Bill at his birthday party. That's the Bill I relate to. That's who I was. I sometimes fear that's who I still am. Laughing, joking, feeling grateful, oblivious to the truth and to what's coming. Blissfully ignorant, but ignorant all the same.